you are having a good day so far. So for today, we'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson. We'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson on adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives and adverbs. All right. So we're going to do our lesson, grade 5 English lesson on adjectives and adverbs. And before we start with our lesson on adjectives and adverbs, we are going to log in to we're going to log into a+students.ca. So we're going to log into a+students.ca. And once we've logged into a+students.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts and we choose grade 5. All right. So now once we have selected language arts, grade 5, and you're going to scroll down up until you get to of adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives and adverbs. And under the chapter of adjectives and adverbs, we are going to be focusing on the lesson of choose between adjectives and adverbs. And the second lesson, or the last lesson, is going to be is the word an adjective or adverb. So that is going to be our lessons for today. And we are doing our lesson on a+students.ca. All right, so an adjective. An adjective is a word that tells about the noun. And adjectives often tells us what kind or they tell us how many. For example, the apples were delicious. So the apples were delicious. So which means that the adjective tells us what kind of apples they were. They were delicious apples. So an adjective is a word that tells us about the noun, and adjectives often tell us what kind or they tell us how many. For example, the apples were delicious. They tell us what kind of apples they were. They were delicious apples. And an adverb, on the other hand, it is a word that tells us about a verb, an adjective, or it tells us about another adverb. And adverbs, they often tell us how, when, or where. So adverbs they often tell us how, when, or where. And for example, Grace ran quickly. Quickly. And quickly basically tells us how Grace runs. She runs quickly. When it comes to the adverbs, right, and the adverbs of when that tells us how, most of the adverbs that tells us how, or most times the adverbs that tell us how, they end in ly, like quickly, hurriedly, sleep, right? They end in ly. All right, so now we're going to aplusstudents.ca. Choose between adjectives and adverbs. So we said an adjective is a word that tells us about the noun, and adjectives they often tell us what kind or they tell us how many. That apple, the apples were delicious. And that tells us what kind of apples they were. It was delicious apples. And in an adverb, it's a word that tells us about a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. And adverbs that often tell us how, when, or where. For example, Grace ran quickly. So basically, the adverb really tells how quickly Grace ran. So it tells us how quickly Grace ran. And most of the adverbs that tells us how, they end in ly, like quickly, hurriedly, sadly. And you can't always use ly to tell whether a word is an adjective or an adverb. For example, she arrives soon. So soon is an adverb. It does not end in ly. Fred has a friendly puppy or friendly dog. Fred has a friendly dog. And friendly is an adjective that ends in ly. So this is basically adjectives and adverbs. So basically when it comes to an adjective and it comes to an adverb, then both these words, which is adjective and an adverb, they tell you more either about the noun or like an adverb, they tell you about the verb. They describe it. So it's more like giving not a description, that they kind of describe the noun or the verb. Especially adjectives. It describes the noun. Because we can even say that the dress is beautifully or beautiful, or the beautiful dress, the red dress, black dress. So that is adjectives and verb. So we are now going to choose the correct word that fits in the sentence. The speaker answered the question and the audience nodded in agreement. we need to choose a specific word. The speaker answered the question and the audience nodded in agreement. Do we say reasonably or reasonable? So the speaker answered the question, is it reasonably or reasonable? So the speaker answered the question and the audience nodded in agreement. He answered the question reasonably or reasonable. All right, so if we're describing the verb, right, and then we can say that the speaker answered the question reasonably, right? So reasonably is our adverb. Reason, reasonably. And basically, reasonably is an adverb, just like we mentioned or we selected. And reasonable is an adjective. And we selected reasonably, which is the adverb, which tells us more about the verb. The audience continued cheering as the performers left the stage. So we are going to have to choose the correct word that fits in the sentence. So we choose the word that best describes the noun in bold. So, for example, the audience continued cheering as the is it remarkable performance left the stage or the remarkably performance or performers left the stage. So we choose the best word to describe the noun and then we're going to say remarkable. The remarkable performers left the stage. Remarkable. And remarkable is an adjective. Remarkably is our adverb. When Beth saw Ronnie's puzzled expression, she teased him about it. So we now need to choose the word that best describes the verb. So when Beth saw Ronnie's puzzled expression, she gently teased him about it, or she gentle teased him about it. So she gently teased about it, or gentle teased him about it. We need to describe the verb. So basically, we need to look for the adverb between that two words, gently and gentle. All right, so basically, we will say she gently teased him about it, gently. So gently being the adverb and gentle being the adjective. All right. The woman decorated her house beautifully yet inexpensively. So we need to choose the word that best describes the noun. The woman decorated her house beautifully, yet inexpensively. So, what type of woman do we say? It's a thrifty woman or thriftily woman? Thrifty woman or woman. We need to describe the noun. Thrifty woman or thriftily woman. All right, so we can say it is a thrifty woman because she's very thrifty, right? Thriftily means that it is an adverb. So we just go with thrifty woman. So thrifty, it describes or tells us about the woman, right? What type of woman she is, what kind of woman she is. She's a thrifty woman. Bella's collection of old jewelry was either lost or stolen during the move. So we need to choose the word that best describes the noun. So Bella's, do we say Bella's entirely or Bella's entire collection of old jewelry was either lost or stolen during the move? So Bella's entirely, or do we say Bella's entire collection of old jewelry was either lost or stolen? We need to choose between one of those words, entirely or entire. All right, so if we choose the correct one, then we can say Bella's entire, because entirely is adverb. So Bella's entire collection of old jewelry was either lost or stolen during the move. Because entirely is an adverb. So entire is the adjective. And the adjective tells us what kind. Bella's entire collection. Tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to the public. So we now need to choose the word that best describes the noun in bold. Tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to the public. Is it the general public or the generally public? Do we say the general public or generally public? General public or generally public? All right, so we can then say the general public. It is the general public because generally is in. So the general public. So tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to the general public. General being the adjective that tells us about, it's open to general public. Generally is our adverb and general is our adjective. All right, so now we're going to the test. We need to choose the word that fits in this. Mr. Osborne suggested that you should proofread your emails before sending them. So do we say Mr. Osborne merely suggested or Mr. Osborne mere suggested? Suggested is a verb. So he merely suggested, merely suggested. When Beth saw Ronnie's puzzled expression, do we say she gently teased him or she gentle teased him? All right, so basically she gently teased him. We can say she gently teased him because gently is our adverb, right? That tells us about the tease, and gentle is adjective. So gently teased him. Tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to the public. Is it the general public or the generally public? General public or generally public? We need to choose the correct one. Is it open to the general public or do we say it is open to the generally public? So we can basically say it is the general public because general tells us it's an adjective. It tells us about, type of public, and generally is an adverb. So general public. The speaker answered the question and the audience nodded in agreement. So was the question reasonably or they answered the question reasonable? Reasonably or reasonable? So the speaker answered the question, we can say reasonably, and the audience nodded in agreement. So reasonably. And the audience continued cheering as the performers left the stage. So basically, we say that the audience continued cheering as the remarkable performers left the stage. Remarkable performers left the stage. Remarkable because remarkably is an adverb. All right. Now we're going to use the word an adjective or an adverb. And remember, we said an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun. And adjectives, they often tell us what kind or they tell us how many. And then we have an adverb, right? And an adverb is a word that tells about a verb. So it tells us about the verb, it tells us about the adjective, or it tells us about another adverb. And adverbs that often tell how, when, or where. For example, Grace ran quickly. So quickly is the adverb that tells us how Grace ran. And most of our adverbs that tells us how, they end in ly. That is why we have reasonably, remarkably, gently, hurriedly, quickly, right? They end in ly. All right. So now we're going to look at the words. It says, is the word in bold an adjective or do you think it's an adverb? Those boys are stubborn, demanding everything their way. We need to say if it is an adjective or an adverb. All right. So now if we look at our specific word, stubborn, right? It basically describes the person or the boy, right? Because it describes how the boys are. So if they are stubborn, then it means that this is an adjective. So we can then now say that this is an adjective. So an adjective, because adjective, stubborn, it tells us about the boys. So what kind of boys are they? They are stubborn boys. Mhm. All right. Alex was pleasantly surprised by the small gift we gave him. Pleasantly surprised. We need to say if pleasantly is either an adjective or is it an adverb. Pleasantly. Alex was pleasantly surprised. So if he was pleasantly surprised, right? then we can say it is an adverb. He was shocked, surprised. It's an adverb. Jerry purchased a shirt made with unusual rough fabric. Rough fabric. We are describing or telling more about the fabric. So, what type of fabric is, or what kind of fabric is it? So, rough fabric. So, basically, rough is telling us about the fabric, which means that it is an adjective. All right. So, rough is an adjective and it tells us about the fabrics. All right, so let's go to our test. Before we go to the test, let's go next first. We already did that one and that one. And we did the rough fabric. All right. Dakota lifts the wounded guinea pig delicately. So Dakota lifts the wounded guinea pig delicately. Delicately. So Dakota lifts the wounded guinea pig delicately. So we can then say in this case, in the sentence, that it is an adverb. So delicately, we would say it is a brown. So delicately, we will go with delicately, which is an adverb. So the crystal casts a shimmering light across the table. So the crystal casts a shimmering across the table. Shimmering. Is shimmering an adjective or is it an adverb? So shimmering. So we can say it's an adjective. Oops. So it's an adjective. So we say it's an adjective. It tells us about the light. It is a beautiful shimmering light. All right. The squirming child struggled to escape her mother's grasp. Squirming child escape her mother's grasp. Squirming. Squirming tells us about the child, right? And it tells us basically about the noun. So it is an adjective. Squirming is an adjective. So squirming is adjective. All right. So now we're going to our test, right? We're going to a test where we are going to see is the word an adjective or is the word an adverb. So we need to say if the word is either an adjective or if the word is an adverb. Please lock the door securely when you depart. Securely is the adjective or an adverb. Please lock the door securely when you depart. Is this an adjective or it's an adverb? Securely. So how do we lock the door? We can say securely, and we can say this is an adverb that tells us how it is locked. The lemonade you made is so refreshing. Is it adjective or it's an adverb? Adjective or adverb? The lemonade you made from scratch is so refreshing. So refreshing, is that an adjective or is it an adverb? The lemonade you made from scratch. It is so refreshing. So is that, do we say it's an adjective or an adverb? Refreshing. All right, so refreshing, we can then say it is an adjective. So adjective, so refreshing is an adjective. It describes, it tells us about the yummy. Volunteers generously constructed a new playground in Newport. Volunteers generously constructed a new playground in Newport. Generously, is it an adjective or an adverb? Generously. Volunteers generously constructed a playground in Newport. So if they are constructing, meaning that they are doing something, so it is telling us about the verb, so it is an adverb. Generously constructed a new playground in Newport. And your final decision was quite reasonable. Your final decision was quite reasonable. Reasonable, is it an adjective or an adverb? Reasonable, is it an adjective or an adverb? All right, so we will say reasonable is an adjective, right? Because reasonably would have been an adverb. So an adjective is reasonable. And then Tori's bracelet has dozens of tiny charms. So tiny tells us about the charms. Is that an adjective or an adverb? Tiny is an adjective or an adverb? Tori's bracelet has dozens of tiny charms. Tiny. So how many charms? Dozens of tiny. What kind? Tiny charms. So we can say it is an adjective. Tells us about the charms. Tells us what kind of charms. Annie was wrongly accused of cheating. Annie was wrongly accused of cheating. Is the word wrongly an adjective or an adverb? Wrongly. Accused. So Annie was wrongly accused of cheating. Is it an adjective or an adverb? All right, so we can then basically say wrongly is an adverb. Because she was wrongly accused of cheating. All right, let's do one last one. Do people really raw fish in some restaurants? Do people really eat raw fish in some restaurants? Is it an adjective or an adverb? Raw fish, raw. Is it an adjective or an adverb? Do people really eat raw fish in some restaurants? So, what kind of fish? We can basically ask ourselves that. Raw fish, which means that this is an adjective. All right. So, that is our lesson on adjectives, adverbs. And we said adjectives, it's words that tells us more about a noun, and it either tells us how many or tells us what kind. And then we have adverbs, right, that tells us more about the verb, the adverb, or it even tells us about an adjective. And adverbs, they often tell us how, when, and where. And most times, the adverbs that tells us how, they end in ly. Like for example, quickly, hurriedly, reasonably, remarkably. So that is our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. All right, so grade 5, thank you very much for joining the class. You should have an amazing evening further. Goodbye.